Chapter 1. I will begin with a few words about my own life up to the day when I met Mr. Gurdjieff. I am a composer. Music has always been for me the talent of the New Testament, given to me by God and demanding that I develop it and work on it unceasingly. It was clear to me long before I met Mr. Gurdjieff, however, that to be able to develop in my creative work something was necessary, something greater or higher than that I could not name. Only if I possessed this something would I be able to progress further and hope to have any real satisfaction from my own creation, and not be ashamed of myself. The words of Beethoven often came to mind. Music is a higher revelation than philosophy or science, and I always remembered, when composing, the wonderful words of a Russian fairy tale. Go, not knowing where, bring, not knowing what. The path is long, the way unknown. The hero knows not how to arrive there by himself alone. He has to seek the guidance and help of higher forces. And so my life was a search. I am not going to speak about the details of the early years of my search, except to say that I came in contact with many ways and met some exceptional people, but they never seemed to be what I was looking for. However, it was through one of them that I met Zara I met A. Zaharoff, who brought me to Mr. Gurdjieff. Zaharoff was an extremely pleasant and highly educated man who became a great friend of ours. By profession, he was a mathematician. Our conversations, however, were always about what was for us the most important thing in life, the search. This was in 1916, during World War I. He came to visit my wife and me in Sarkoyi, Salo, where I was stationed by the army as reserve guards officer. Then, in the fall of 1916, he told me that he had met a teacher, a real teacher, but he did not reveal his name nor how he had met him. One day, I was taking Zaharoff to the station. He began to speak about this teaching, which, he said, could be an answer to our great question. The gist, he said, is this: man on his present level of being does not possess an immortal, indestructible soul. But with certain work on himself, he can form an immortal soul. Then this newly formed soul body will no longer be subordinate to the laws of the physical body, and after the death of the physical body will continue to exist. After a long pause following this statement, Zaharoff added, "But there is something which will perhaps puzzle you. You see, it is generally supposed that higher knowledge is given gratuitously. But in this case, if you and your wife should wish to join this work, you would have to pay a certain amount." He named the sum of money. Although it was quite large, $1,000, it was possible at that time for us to pay it. As I had often been disillusioned and noticed that my wife was not listening closely or seriously to what he was saying, I began to speak with Zaharoff alone, and as she did not know about the teacher whom Zaharoff had met, I decided not to tell her about him until I had seen him myself. I asked Zaharoff several times when he would introduce me to this man, but he always answered, "I promised you, when the time comes, I will tell you." In the middle of December, Zaharoff told me that if I still wished to meet this man, I would have to be at the restaurant Palkin the next Sunday between 6 and 7 in the evening. It was a very large restaurant on the corner of the Nevsky Prospect, the main street of St. Petersburg, but one but one to which no officer of the guard would ever go. Zaharoff would come there to take me to see Mr. Gurdjieff. I went. Zaharoff finally appeared, and we started toward the big Nikolaevsky Vokzal, the railway station, on the same Nevsky Prospect. Suddenly he stopped before a house and led the way to the second floor, where there was a cafe. To say the least, it was a cafe for an extremely mixed crowd, which walked the Nevsky day and night, and if anyone were to find out that I had been there, I would have had to leave my regiment. We went in, ordered coffee, and waited. After a while, I saw coming towards us Dr. S., whom I had met before socially, and two men in black coats, both very typical Caucasians, with black eyes and black mustaches. They were very well dressed, but so Caucasian. I wondered which one was he, and I must say that my first reaction was anything but one of rapture or veneration. All three approached and we shook hands. Which one of the two was he? My uncertainty was quickly dispelled by the eyes of one of the men. The man with those eyes sat at the narrow side of the table. On the right sat Dr. S. with the other man, and on his left myself and Zaharov. There was a moment of heavy silence. My eyes could not avoid noticing the detachable cuffs, which were not very clean. Then I thought, you have to speak. I made a great effort and forced myself to say to him that I wished to be admitted to his work. Mr. Gurdjieff asked the reason for my request. Perhaps I was not happy in life, or was there some other special reason? I answered that I was perfectly happy, happily married, that I had enough money to live on without having to earn my living, and that I had my music, which was the center of my life. But, I added, all this was not enough. Without inner growth, I said, there is no life at all for me. Both my wife and I are searching for a way to develop. By this time, I realized that the eyes of Mr. Gurdjieff were of unusual depth and penetration. The word beautiful would hardly be appropriate, but I will say that until that moment, I had never seen such eyes nor felt such a look. Mr. Gurdjieff listened and then said that we would speak later about the question that interested me. Meanwhile, he said to Dr. S., let Uspensky tell him everything which has been said up to now, and let him also read the story, Glimpses of Truth. I decided to ask Mr. Gurdjieff whether I could perhaps bring some money for his work. He answered, the time will come when if I should ask you to give me all that belongs to you, you would gladly do so, but for the time being nothing is necessary. This ended the conversation, and Zaharov and I left. For a long time I could not speak. Not until we reached the Litianaya Street did I tell Zaharov about my strong impression and about Mr. Gurdjieff's eyes. Yes, he said, I understand, and certainly you will never see such eyes again. Having given this short account of my first meeting with Mr. Gurdjieff, I would now like to tell you something else about it, that surely it was planned by Mr. Gurdjieff himself. Everything was done by him to create unfavorable conditions for me, beginning with my going to the restaurant Paul Kin, and then to the cafe where, at one point, Mr. Gurdjieff said, there are usually more whores here. Everything, including this coarse observation, was supposed not to attract, but rather to repel a newcomer, or if not to repel him, at least to make him hurdle the difficulties, holding fast to his aim in spite of everything. After this meeting, my life became a sort of fairy tale. I had read fairy tales since early childhood, and their meaning stayed with me always, to go forward and never forget the real aim, to overcome obstacles, to hope for help from unknown sources if one's aspiration were a true one. Also, it seems that if you keep striving for one great purpose, you will win things you never dreamed of in addition. But woe to you if you allow yourself to be diverted, if you are tempted by something cheap. The wish to be with Mr. Gurdjieff now became the only reality. Ordinary life, which had been reality, continued, but it seemed almost unreal, so I had taken the first step. After that meeting, I had to find Uspensky. He lived on Troitskaya Street, not far from the Nevsky. When I rang the bell, a man in a pince-nez opened the door. It was P.D. Uspensky. He had been mobilized by the army, but had been released because of nearsightedness. Now, he need wear his uniform only a little longer. From the start, he made a very strong impression of me. He was simple, courteous, approachable, and intelligent. Without wasting time, he began to tell me what he later wrote in his book, In Search of the Miraculous. In an amazingly simple and clear way, He knew how to explain the complicated scheme of worlds, planets, cosmoses, and so on, so that all this could be assimilated by anyone seriously interested in these aspects of Mr. Gurdjieff's teaching. At the end of our talk, he gave me the typed notes of Mr. Gurdjieff's first meeting with somebody, as taken down by one of his pupils. As soon as I returned to Sarkoye Selo, I gave these notes to my wife to read. But when she had finished, she said, "Such a man I would like to meet." But when I told her that I had already met him, well, she was quite put out. I explained the reason, that we had already met so many people we did not like, that this time I had decided to see for myself first, to spare her a disappointment. Needless to say, her wish to meet this teacher was stronger than any other emotion, and we waited impatiently for the day when Mr. Gurdjieff would return to St. Petersburg, so that we might go to him together. By the beginning of February, Mr. Gurdjieff had not yet returned from Moscow, and I was due to leave for the front at the end of the month. The revolution advanced slowly but surely. Everyone we knew in the city still lived as usual, but rioting had begun in the suburbs. At last, Mr. Gurdjieff arrived. We were called to come to a meeting which took place in the apartment of Mr. and Mrs. Uspensky. There were comparatively few people at this meeting. They occupied chairs in front of a sofa on which, later, Mr. Gurdjieff sat. Most of these people were already acquainted with the ideas now available from the book In Search of the Miraculous. This meeting was not a lecture, and very little was said, but my wife and I both felt a strong atmosphere of inner questioning. From time to time, someone would break the silence with a brief inquiry. The mood was not one of lukewarm people interested in the occult teachings fashionable at that time. These were people for whom the answering of inner questions, the finding of a way to real active work on themselves, truly formed the center of their lives. I can give you the impression that this meeting made on my wife in her own words. In February 1917, we lived in Tsarskoye Selo, the residence of the Tsar, because my husband had been recalled to his regiment as reserve officer and was to go to the front at the end of the month. It was a cold winter day, and we sat in our study occupied with our individual work. My husband handed me a typescript and asked whether I would like to read it. I began to read it at once, and when I reached the place where it said that nobody can initiate you but you yourself, I stopped and told my husband, if we could find the man who said this, I would gladly follow his teaching. For several years, my husband had been looking for someone who could help him find a way to a better understanding of life, but time and again he had fallen on false help, or worse. In reply, my husband told me that he had not only found this man, but also met him. Instead of being glad, I flared up, reproaching him for not having told me. It was our first quarrel, but my desire to know more about this man was stronger than my irritation, and when I calmed down, I discovered that he was soon to return from Moscow, and my husband would be able to see him and take me along. Finally, the day came. It happened to be my younger sister's birthday, and my parents were giving a ball for her, which of course we had to attend. The meeting was arranged for 8:30 in the evening in the apartment of Mr. and Mrs. Uspensky, whom I did not yet know. The room was not very large. In front of a Turkish sofa, about 15 people were sitting on chairs. The man we longed so much to see was not in the room. Everything seemed quite strange to me, and I was struck by the sincere and simple way in which the people spoke. Dr. S., who appeared to be at the head of the group, asked the people what they could say in answer to the question which had been put to them last time. The question was, what is the main thing which stops a man from advancing on the way to self-development? There were several different answers. One said it was money, another fame, yet another love, and so on. As newcomers, we sat near the window facing the sofa. Quite unexpectedly, and like a black panther, a man of oriental appearance, such as I had never seen before, came in. He went to the sofa and sat down with his legs crossed in the Eastern manner. He asked what they were speaking about, and Dr. S. reported the question and the answers. When he mentioned love, Mr. Gurdjieff interrupted him. Yes, it is true. Love is the strongest obstacle to man's development. At that moment, I thought, again, the same. Always we have to part. We cannot think of self development and stay together. And I was quite disturbed. However, Mr. Gurdjieff continued, but what kind of love? There are different kinds. When it is self love, egotistical love, or temporary attraction, it hinders because it ties a man down and he is not free. But if it is real love, with each one wishing to help the other, then it is different, and I am always glad if husband and wife are both interested in these ideas because they can help each other. I could scarcely look up. Nevertheless, I had a distinct feeling that Mr. Gurdjieff was looking at me. Today, I am certain that he said this especially for me. I was in a very strange state. I was so happy. Then we had to leave and go to the ball. As I entered the ballroom of my parents' home, I suddenly had a definite feeling as if something had hit me in the chest. The people who were dancing seemed to be puppets. Within a few days, I was able to see Mr. Gurdjieff alone. The first thing he asked me was how I had felt when I went home after the meeting. I did not know how to express my experience. I did not even realize that it was an experience. But I told him about the strangest feeling I had had when I entered the ballroom. He answered that it was good, or that he was glad. I do not really remember, except that he was satisfied and said that if we wished, my husband and I could always come to see him whenever he was in St. Petersburg. I told him that my husband had to go to the front and that neither of us would be there much longer, as I wanted to follow my husband as far as I would be allowed to go. I also asked whether it was not possible for my husband to avoid going to the front. No, he said. When you live among wolves, you have to howl like a wolf. But you should not be taken over by the psychosis of war. And inside, you should try to be far removed from all this. Although we had seen Mr. Gurdjieff only twice, I joined my husband in his decision to grasp every opportunity of seeing him again. Now, to continue my own story, we saw Mr. Gurdjieff once more in St. Petersburg. A few days before, we had to leave for Kiev. From there, we would go on to the front. And there's a footnote here. We took the last train leaving Petrograd while the Tsar still reigned. We stayed in Kiev for 5 days not knowing what was going on. Then we learned that the Tsar had abdicated and that a temporary government was functioning. Back to the text. Before parting from Mr. Gurdjieff, I asked his advice about my military service. He told me, "You are an officer and you must go to the front, but never let yourself be seized by the war psychosis. Remember yourself. Don't forget to remember yourself. You will see that revolution will break out totally one of these days, and everything will be finished. Staying at the front then will make no sense from the military point of view. Try to get away then and come where I shall be." After a short pause, he added, turning to Dr. S., who was there, "He has to be entangled. Entangle him, doctor." Then, addressing me again, "Remember yourself. Don't forget to remember yourself." Self-remembering is the central idea of Mr. Gurdjieff's teaching. As for entangling, this connects with another of his ideas, that faith in his teaching is not required. Quite the opposite is necessary. In fact, the teacher, while constantly directing and observing the pupil, at the same time changes his course, diverts him, even provokes him with apparent contradictions, in order to force him to find out for himself what is true. This is possible only if the pupil has within him the strongest urge to persevere, a burning wish that will not permit him to be stopped by any obstacle. It was not till August 28th, 1917, that we next met Mr. Gurdjieff, this time in Essentuki in the Caucasus. It would not take too long to narrate everything that happened during those months from February to August, but through every event there ran, like a red thread, my efforts to reach Mr. Gurdjieff. There was every kind of difficult circumstance. Indeed, it was precisely because of hindrances that my wife and I were able at last to join Mr. Gurdjieff in the Caucasus. A mutiny of soldiers that threatened my life resulted in my being sent to Petrograd. But since Petrograd had become the center of the revolution, I had to find a way for us to escape from that city. Since my only thought was to go where Mr. Gurdjieff was, to the Caucasus, I hit upon the idea of getting permission to go to Rostov near the Black Sea, because the revolution had not yet touched the south of Russia. There, I could continue working on my military inventions, one of which had already been accepted by the army. But to be assigned to that particular place seemed unlikely. Then fate or accident helped me. It was like a fairy tale. I met one of my relatives on the street. When he asked me what I was doing in Petrograd, I told him my story, and as he went to the adjutant of one of the Grand Dukes in charge of the artillery, I had the necessary papers the very next morning. We left at once, but instead of going to Rostov, we went straight to Essentuki. The morning after we left Petrograd, soldiers came to the home of my wife's parents to arrest me. Wow. Going back a little in my story, I should like to relate how remembering myself once saved my life. I was attached to the staff of our regiment, and we were in the trenches. One day, about 4 p.m, I was sent with a report to headquarters. I got on my horse and rode along a flat highland from which the road descended into a valley. Soon I heard scattered artillery shots repeated every 3 minutes. I met a soldier who told me that the Germans were tossing them into the valley along the road I had to take. It was impossible to turn back and not deliver my report, so I continued on my way. The words of Mr. Gurdjieff, "Remember yourself," came to my mind. Although I had heard them only once and then without explanation, I understood their meaning in my own way and found myself in a new state of deep calm as soon as I began to repeat them and cling to them. I could see craters made by freshly exploded shells on the road before me. As I continued my ride, I repeated to myself, "I remember myself." This did not hinder me at all from seeing what was going on around me. Suddenly, I heard the crescendo of an artillery shell as it screamed towards me. It blew up very close, but just because of its very nearness, neither my horse nor I was hurt. Footnote here. The initial line of direction of a splinter from the explosion of an Austrian-type shell on a level plain was very high. That is why the splinters did not hit those who were quite near. Back to the text. But my horse shied and fell into a shallow ditch. I jumped off, repeating all the time, "I remember myself." The horse got up, ran a short distance, and stopped. I was inwardly calm, but I had to decide quickly in which direction to run, since another shell would burst in less than 3 minutes. There is a theory that shells never fall twice in the same place. Should I then go and lie down in the crater where the shell had just landed? No. Should I try to catch the horse? If I could, I would get away from this dangerous spot, and that is what I did. The next shell didn't wait, and it fell and burst near the last crater. Remembering myself had kept me calm and allowed me to make the right decision at the crucial moment. It was already dark, about 8 p.m, when we arrived in Essentuki and drove to a little house, our luggage on 2 carriages, and accompanied by our chambermaid, Marfausha. We rang the bell at the gate. It was opened by a man dressed simply in a Russian belted shirt and a worn coat, unshaven and smelling of sweat, like a laborer. It was difficult to recognize him as the invariably smart and elegant Zaharov. My wife looked in at the window and saw a table with empty tea glasses, an oil lamp. There was no electricity because of the war. No tablecloth. Men and women were sitting around it. The women with scarves tied around their heads like peasants. Later she told me it reminded her of a scene from Gorky's Underworld. Mr. Gurdjieff came out and in a very kind way asked us to come in. Then he asked his wife to give us something to eat. Turning to Zaharov with an especially sweet voice, he said, Andreich, and now the samovarchik." Footnote here. I learned later that Zaharov had to prepare samovarachik many times a day, and that it was a very troublesome business. The little pieces of wood and coal which one puts underneath do not burn easily. One has to blow on them, and if one turned away for a moment, the flame went out and it was necessary to start all over. When everyone had finished drinking the real China tea, Mr. Gurdjieff, to our great surprise, ordered, "Take the table away and line up." In 1 second the table disappeared, and everyone lined up in the middle of the room. "March!" Mr. Gurdjieff commanded, and they all began to march, to turn, to run, and to do all kinds of exercises. This lasted quite a long time. When those who took part were tired, Mr. Gurdjieff told them to sit down and rest. Mr. Gurdjieff had noticed during tea that I took mine with 2 pieces of sugar. So now he said, "You must not eat sweets or you will have sugar disease." He most certainly was not speaking of diabetes, though it is true that I was rather portly and that sweets, which I loved, were not good for me. But his reason for my not eating them was to produce an inner struggle with a strong habit. Mr. Gurdjieff often gave this exercise, to struggle with habits, to those who were beginning to work on themselves. Next day, tired from traveling, we got up late. For a long time we discussed our impressions of the previous evening, and, although nothing extraordinary had taken place, and as yet we understood little of all this, we both felt that we had seen real evidence of inner work. In the evening, Mr. Gurdjieff took my wife and me for a walk. We went a long way into the town to buy a kulich, a cake. On our return, Mr. Gurdjieff began to accelerate his pace, increasing it all the time. Finally, he was practically running. We tried not to lag behind and ran some distance in this way. We knew he was testing us to see what we could endure and how we would take it. Back at the house, Mr. Gurdjieff made us all repeat gestures and grimaces which he made. Suddenly he shouted, "Stop!" and everyone froze with the grimace which he wore at that moment. My wife and I did not know then about this stop exercise and others of this kind. But we stopped also, and Mr. Gurdjieff called to me to notice how my wife held the expression on her face, without thinking about how ugly she looked. During the evening there was some talk about Mr. Gurdjieff going to Persia, and about how he would earn the necessary money by breaking stones on the road. That put us into a state of anxiety. Persia? How could I, as an officer, go there in wartime? It would mean becoming a deserter. Next morning, the 3rd day after our arrival in Essentuki, Mr. Gurdjieff announced that he was leaving that evening for Persia. Not a word about how, nor any other details. We had come in order to be with Mr. Gurdjieff, regardless of difficulties. Now, anxiety, doubts, insecurity about the future brought us many questions. What should we do? On top of everything else, we had to think about our faithful Marfausha and her husband, my orderly. I had told him to join us in Essentuki after he had put our valuables into safekeeping in Moscow, which we supposed was still possible. In a few hours, however, we discovered that Mr. Gurdjieff, his wife, and Zaharov were going the following morning only to Tuapse in the Caucasus. He told us that, if we wished, we could come along. Without a moment's hesitation, we decided to go and to stay with him as long as possible. Later, we realized this was the right thing to do. Going to Tuapse was the first lamp post, to use an expression of Mr. Gurdjieff's. So the next day we took the train to Tuapse, and the following morning went to see Mr. Gurdjieff in his hotel. We found him lying on his bed, covered by a carpet. In the room with him were also his wife, Madame O's daughter, and Zaharov. Nobody spoke. We sat down and were silent. I felt the heavy atmosphere which overwhelms one when he does not know what to do. Mr. Gurdjieff certainly knew how to create such an atmosphere. Finally, I could not bear it any longer, and asked him about his plans concerning Persia, and how we could manage to follow him there. "As I have no money to go there in the ordinary way," he replied, "I will make a contract to break stones on the road. I have already told you that. It is a most distinguishing job. It is not possible for you, because after a day's work, the woman must wash the worker's feet and Z's feet, for instance, will smell awfully bad. Lenochka, well, she can wash feet, but your wife cannot. Again, the heavy silence descended, and for most of the day this pressure continued. My wife was in despair. She accused me of not speaking to Mr. Gurdjieff in the right way, of not realizing our dangerous position. My military papers were not in order, since we had come straight to Essentuki without stopping in Rostov. The next day she stayed in our hotel, saying she did not wish to go with me again to see Mr. Gurdjieff. Then the tension began to relax, because Mr. Gurdjieff told me, I know you have to go to Rostov for your papers, and perhaps when you return I will not yet have left for Persia. So my wife and I went to Rostov by the first train. It happened that the commanding officer of the military garrison there was my former tutor, who liked me very much. Without delay he ordered my papers to be signed, giving me leave for 2 more weeks. The next day we were back with Mr. Gurdjieff. In our absence, Mr. Gurdjieff had bought a cart called a shooting brake and 2 young horses. In the evening we went to the hills to try them out, with Mr. Gurdjieff, his wife, and Zaharov. He now said that if we wished to go with him, we would be able to load the cart with only the most necessary things, 1 suitcase per person, and that we must be ready to start the next Sunday. We immediately decided to go, leaving our maid Marfusha in the hotel with the rest of our belongings. All the luggage was piled on the cart, and soon it was about 3 feet high, so there was no room for anyone to sit except the driver and Mr. Gurdjieff himself. When Sunday came, Mr. Gurdjieff told us we would have lunch in a restaurant and then start in the direction of Sochi on the Black Sea. We were to walk straight over the mountains, taking a shortcut because the main road was too winding. Then we were to wait for Mr. Gurdjieff at the place where the shortcut crossed the main road. Since Mr. Gurdjieff's wife was walking with us, my wife was reassured that he would not just drop us on the road. She did not yet have full confidence in Mr. Gurdjieff, but she still wished to follow him as long as she could, because everything she had heard in his talks interested her intensely. The distance on the shortcut was much greater than we had expected. It was hard climbing and very hot. Neither my wife nor I was prepared for such a trip, and our inappropriate clothing made it still more difficult. Finally, at the junction with the road, we found an inn, old and far from clean. Being tired and thirsty, we went in for tea. It was already dark and Mr. Gurdjieff had not come. Luckily, we had money, and so we thought we would stay the night if necessary. At long last, Mr. Gurdjieff arrived. Then we all had something to eat, and we hoped to sleep, but Mr. Gurdjieff said, "The night is so wonderful, the moon is shining. Is it not better to continue?" So we went on. Now real effort began. Mr. Gurdjieff told us merely that he wished to cover a good distance, but as to where and how far, he said not a word. My feet began to be swollen and sore. My wife had been wearing high-heeled shoes, and even before we got to the inn, her feet ached terribly. Still, we wished to go on. We passed through places of extraordinary beauty. The road wound over mountain slopes covered with ancient trees. The moon was full, and at some turns in the road we could glimpse the sea glittering in the moonlight. We went on and on, following the cart closely. The moon was setting. If was now about 2 in the morning, and we had started at 2 in the afternoon. Mr. Gurdjieff finally said, "Now let us look for a place to rest." But each time a suitable resting place appeared, he made the horses run a little faster, and we had to catch up with the cart. Much later, we came to a rough little clearing where heaps of stones were surrounded by scrubby bushes. Here, at long last, Mr. Gurdjieff stopped and told us to unharness the horses. We filled a pail of water for them and a pot to make tea for ourselves from a spring by the roadside. We needed a fire for the tea and wood for a fire. A fine rain had begun, and to find dry kindling we had to struggle through thorny bushes in the dark. It was a real endurance test, but finally the fire was burning and the tea ready, and we each had a cup with a piece of bread. I had to drink mine without sugar, I, who always liked it very sweet. After tea, Mr. Gurdjieff told us to go to sleep. But where to lie down? There was no place but on the stones. And you, he said, addressing me, you will be on guard duty during the night. So I never closed my eyes. Of course, there was not much left of the night. At dawn, Mr. Gurdjieff got up and called, "Get up! We have still a long way to go today." We packed the partly open luggage, harnessed the horses, and began to walk again. My wife was unable to put on her shoes because her feet were bleeding and swollen. She tied pieces of cardboard on her feet to serve as sandals, but of course these did not last long, and she had to walk barefoot. Another surprise awaited me. Since I had not slept the whole night, Mr. Gurdjieff told me, as a special favor, to climb up and sit on top of the luggage. The day was hot, the sun began to burn, and after a night without sleep I could hardly keep my eyes open. But if I let them close for a moment, I nearly fell off the cart. It would have been easier to struggle with the desire to sleep while walking. Mr. Gurdjieff knew this very well and was asking of me a super effort, and I tried to make such an effort. I felt that all that had taken place and what was to come was again like a fairy tale, in which it was necessary to do the almost impossible in order to achieve one's aim. But these things could not occur in this way only in a little group of people led by Mr. Gurdjieff, that is, led by a real teacher. Now where were we going? It was said to Persia, so we took it at that. At last, Mr. Gurdjieff took pity on me and told me to walk. My military trousers had already hurt my legs, rubbing them quite raw, and my feet ached in my unsuitable shoes. It was midday, and we were passing through a big village. Mr. Gurdjieff told his wife and Zaharov to take the large kettle with a lid and go to the inn to get food, and told the rest of us to walk on. Soon they overtook us, and we stopped in a wonderful little meadow covered with silky green grass and shady trees, with a mountain spring nearby. We unharnessed the horses, gave them water and food, drank the spring water ourselves with great pleasure, and sat on blankets. Then came the food brought in the kettle. It was lamb with green beans, and we had as much of it as we wished. Now Mr. Gurdjieff told us we could rest. We lay down and fell asleep immediately. What a sleep it was! For the remainder of that day's journey, we were not a bit tired. We stopped for the night not far from a small village in a tiny glen, which was surrounded on three sides by great trees and impenetrable bushes. We saw that there were apple trees too, the remains of the settlement of the ancient Cherkess tribes. We built a fire at once and gathered enough wood to keep it burning all night long, because there were wolves, jackals, and bears in the surrounding woods. During the night we saw the glow of their eyes and heard their howling. If we had had no fire, they could easily have killed our horses. In the morning we were told that wolves had killed a cow from the village that same night when the animal ventured into the fields. After tea and something to eat, we arranged to watch the fire in turns, and everyone prepared to sleep except Zaharov, who had the first watch. We took our thin mattresses, spread them under the trees, and lay down. What a beautiful night it was! Dark as it can be only in the south, the stars were brighter than ever. The Caucasus, wolves, jackals howling, knowing nothing of what tomorrow would bring, we were, nevertheless, happy in a way we had not known before. It was my wife's turn to be on guard before sunrise, and after her, Mr. Gurdjieff himself. I was already up, and I still remember the kindness of his voice when he greeted her. "Good morning, Jan, dear," in Armenian. He evidently wished to reassure her in this terribly strange situation. When the sun was up, we were ready to start. This time Mr. Gurdjieff put us all astride the luggage, and slowly we moved on. About noon we reached a deserted post house. It was a nice peasant house with a stable for the horses. The trees in the garden were covered with ripe figs. We stayed there for 2 days and had a real rest. Here I would like to stress certain points again. Mr. Gurdjieff demanded from us a very great effort, especially difficult because we did not know when it would end. We suffered and would have been only too happy to rest, but there was no protest in us, because the one thing we really wished to do was to follow Mr. Gurdjieff. Beside that, everything else seemed unimportant. This sudden plunging of the whole man This sudden plunging of the whole man into the work was very characteristic of Mr. Gurdjieff. During our stay in the post house, we slept well, each napping after lunch, and had wonderful food and wine, which we bought from a nearby estate. I went there once with Mr. Gurdjieff. On our way back, we sat by the roadside, and he said, "When working with pupils, I am like a coachman. If the horse goes to the left, I pull the right rein, and if the right, I pull the left one." I attach great meaning and significance to these words because they seem so essential to his teaching. After 2 days of rest, we started again. The road became more and more mountainous, and several times Mr. Gurdjieff asked Zaharov and me to push the cart, and at the same time to count 1, 2, 3, 4, and then back. In other words, he asked us to divide our attention. We walked the whole day, but strangely, there was no sign of the tiredness of the first days. In the initial effort, Mr. Gurdjieff seemed to have pushed through some resistance in us, so that physical effort was no longer frightening. The weather began to change, and it was very damp and slippery in the woods, so another physical strain was added. Now Mr. Gurdjieff said he intended to reach a definite place, a lumber mill that belonged to his brother-in-law. Finally, very late at night, we reached it and passed the night in little cabins probably used for storing wood. We got up early. It continued to rain. About noon, we came to a very beautiful place near Soki, on a hill, surrounded by mountains that descended on our right to the Black Sea. It reminded me of Cairns or Nice. There were some country houses with rose gardens, and the roses were the largest I had ever seen. It was all as beautiful as paradise. We passed a little shop, and as we had nothing to eat since early morning, we bought bread and sardines. While we ate, Mr. Gurdjieff went into the shop, where he stayed for a long time. When he finally came out, he told us to open a large wooden gate almost opposite the shop. There a road led to a country house and a shed, and a slope ran down to the Black Sea. It transpired that Mr. Gurdjieff had rented this house, and it was in a village called Ouchdari. It appeared that we had arrived in Persia. I think Mr. Gurdjieff is the only man on earth who with a few people ever made an expedition which, when looked at from the outside, seemed so unnecessary and ended with nothing, but it was full of meaning and value for those who took part in it and who remembered why they came. After a preliminary short session of work on attention, self-observation, and discovering America, as Mr. Gurdjieff called the discoveries we made in ourselves, he gave us another kind of work. By speaking of going to Persia and by creating all kinds of emotional and physical difficulties, he was creating in strange surroundings a ladder of obstacles over which we had to pass to reach a certain little do in ourselves a ladder of obstacles over which we had to pass to reach a certain little dough in ourselves, that dough in the scale of our general development. These were the scales within scales, about which Mr. Gurdjieff spoke so often. If we look literally for scales, we will never find them. Our whole earthly life is perhaps not one full scale, but only part of one, made up of a great many little scales, with their half tones, mi, fa, which we must pass. So, by completing one tiny scale, our group came to another scale, about which I will speak in the following chapter. This expedition was for us a miniature foretaste of another that took place a year later.